pleasure to spend this time with you all. Just want to thank Dr. Cummings and Dr. Chandler for the opportunity that they've created for us to come together today in this space. The topic of our conversation is cultural competency in higher education and overview. My goal is to bring us into some conversation and dialogue related to cultural competency in the context of higher education. And so looking forward to some of the discussions that we'll have. Just to remind us or share, today's presentation is designed to be highly interactive, and so we will use multiple resources to keep us engaged throughout our time together, and so looking forward to that. Just to get us started, really want to invite each of you as we engage in our conversation today to think about and pull from some of the pre-assignments that were given to us in preparation for our time today. The questions were shared in our Google Classroom. Specifically, the question for today is, in what ways does cultural competency and inclusion show up in your spaces? And so as we're engaging in conversation with our colleagues and in the material that will be presented, think about that question in the backdrop. How and in what ways does cultural competency and inclusion show up in our spaces? And so I look forward to what we learn together today. A little bit of housekeeping as we get started in our conversation might be helpful to help us engage fully today. One is, if you are comfortable and able to, I understand life circumstances may not allow, but if you are comfortable and able to, we invite all to use our cameras throughout the day. I think that in this time of COVID and distance learning, we work to try to minimize what we lose from the in-person contact, right? And so our nonverbals, our eye contact, our smiles even, the beautiful hair that I see on screens, all of those things add an element to our learning that we want to try to hold on to if possible. And again, if you're able and comfortable, we invite you to use your cameras and turn those on. Similarly, to help create a learning space that everyone can engage in, we invite everyone to use your mute feature and keep yourselves muted during the session that when we're not engaging in dialogue and conversation. And so we will definitely invite you all to unmute when those opportunities present themselves throughout the presentation. We also would love to make sure that y'all know if there are questions at any point in time, please feel free to engage by adding your question to the chat, and we will make sure to make space and time to engage with questions that may come up throughout the conversation. Want to invite us to also practice some self-awareness. There are going to be 2 or 3 different opportunities for us to engage in small group conversations or in parent shares, and we'll give you a time frame that will allow for each discussion. Just want to make sure that we're sharing space and being cognizant of the time so that our colleagues can also share their experiences with us. One of the things that I believe in this type of work and in these types of opportunities is that each of us will have various gifts that we can share, but we also have gifts that we need to receive in these interactions and spaces. And so being mindful of our time and sharing time will allow us to be in a place to receive gifts from our peers as they share their experiences, their stories, their advice, and vice versa. Finally, I know Zoom has a wonderful feature and does remind us or let us know that the session will be recorded. And so just as a reminder that the session is being recorded today. With that said, let's start looking at what we hope to cover today. I do use presentation overviews in most of my workshops and even when I'm teaching class. It helps me to stay on time and focused, sometimes in conversations and dialogue, and just being able to connect with colleagues from around the country. We can definitely enjoy that space and time, and can get distracted at times. And so overviews for me are a tool that I use to help us stay focused, and to share with you all what we hope to discuss. We will get started with a session discussion on our outcomes, so that you know what we hope to deliver today or gain from today. We'll from there move into an activity focused on looking at key moments in history within higher education related to race and ethnicity. From that activity, we will transition to building shared and common language, and making sure that the words that we use and that we see often have the similar meaning, so that we can build from there. We will take a break after common language, and then after the break, we will jump into building our awareness and knowledge through an activity, and then end with engaging with a theoretical model that may be helpful to pull all of these pieces together. At any point in time, please know that I encourage us to practice self-care. And so if there is a need before the break or after the break to stretch, to move around, I welcome all of those practices to help us engage in self-care. And so session outcomes, to get us started, what we hope to cover today and gain from today, to remind us for this particular session, include really thinking about the historical context, where we have been, what leads us to this moment in time. I think being able to look at our past in society and in institutions help us really frame and position what we may be experiencing and seeing in our spaces, in our classes, in our research today. And so I look forward to what we may uncover from this conversation related to key moments that are impacting higher education even today from our history. Second is introducing you and maybe engaging further, if you are already familiar with Bobby Harrow's cycle of socialization, that theoretical framework that I think will give us language and opportunity to continue engaging in our own understanding about our journey, and also what we may be seeing in relationship to others. And so look forward to that piece. And then finally, in many of these conversations, I think it is wonderful to engage in just the practice of learning, but I'm hoping to also encourage us to think about what we can do, what individuals can do moving forward. And so it's the action piece. We don't want to just learn for our own sake. We want to think about what we can use, or how we can use information and experiences and stories to shape the spaces that we get to interact with. And so from our sphere of influence, what are actions that we can commit to? And so we hope that these outcomes will be helpful to all of us. And so this brings us now to thinking about or engaging in the first part of our presentation, entitled Key Moments in History Focused on Race and Ethnicity in American Higher Education. And so scholarship has been challenged, I think, or has challenged our understanding over time related to diversity within the context of social justice. It is about confronting systems that privilege some groups and challenge the defensiveness that we see in terms of reactions from other groups. The conversations that I hope that we engage in related to social justice in higher education is really focused on dismantling those systems, or what we can do to engage in dismantling systems that benefit some and not all. And so another piece of information that may be helpful as we move into our conversation is that my approach in presenting today will really focus on systemic pieces and broader conversation versus individuals, right? Outside of our own self-reflection, my approach to diversity work is not to look at the actions of one, but really look at how can we shift groups, communities, and systems toward justice. And so one of the pieces that I will also share as I introduce this activity that I learned from some colleagues of ours that work in museum work that may be helpful is that when we look at history and time or timelines, I like to think of them or use the analogy of a museum. I hope that you all have engaged or enjoy museums as much as I do. When I go into a museum, what I've noticed is that curators have the ability to really take a space and transform that space. Curators get to decide every aspect of an exhibit. And I would offer this conversation today as we get started with key moments in history as a tour of a museum exhibit. And I'm get to be the curator of that particular exhibit or the one that we're engaging with. Curators get to decide the period of time that is covered, the style of art, the artists themselves that get featured, and coordinating those pieces into some kind of thematic representation for us to learn, engage, and critique. And so for this particular piece, there may be some dates as you're going through the timeline that you're like, Miguel, I don't know why you didn't include X, Y, or Z. But know that I welcome those pieces of feedback. Please feel free to share any key moments in history that you may feel might be missing or might add value to the conversation in the future. But know that my focus was really to look at moments where higher education engaged with aspects of race and ethnicity. And so gender is not included. There may be moments in history that are very important to us individually that you may not see here. And again, just keep in mind that what our focus is. Finally, I share this anytime I use this activity in my classes or in presentations. Again, if there are moments in history that you think would add wonderfully to this particular piece, please feel free to share that with me outside of the presentation. What I'd love to do now is, I feel like I've been talking for a minute, and I want to definitely yield the floor to all of you to share in a small group discussion. And so in just a moment, Leslyn will help us by inviting us into small group rooms for you to have a discussion. And what I'd like to start with is one of the pieces, one of the assignments related to the timeline. And so if you will engage with the following two questions that you see on the screen, we'll also post those questions in the chat room for you all to hold on to while you're engaging in your small group discussions. But please focus on maybe sharing with your group. Of course, introduce yourself, welcome each other into that space, but then share maybe one or more than two dates that really stand out to you from that particular review of the historical timeline that was available to you in the Google Classroom. And then second, if there was a theme that emerged for you as you reviewed this particular document, please share that theme or the pattern that you felt emerged for you as you reviewed that. We're going to move into our breakout rooms, and remember, to share space and be mindful of that. We'll give you approximately 10 minutes to engage in this conversation, and then we'll bring us back into the larger room. Enjoy your first breakout session. Back, your conversations went well. what I'd like to do is use the chat feature, if you're comfortable using the chat feature, and just please add maybe your significant moment that you spoke about, what stood out to you, so that the larger room can benefit from your takeaway, and then maybe the pattern or the theme that emerged for you. And so if you're comfortable, please feel free to add that to the chat room. I'm going to share my screen again and just highlight a few of these dates that may have emerged in your conversations. And so when I think about this timeline, our starting place for this particular activity for me is around how the United States government situated access to participation in our democracy. And so in 1790, the first act of Congress, the very first Congress, was to state that citizenship would be granted to free white persons. The use of the word persons in that time excluded women and people of color. And so when I think about this, the construction of race and ethnicity in this country, and access to power and access to engaging in our government and in our incivility, if you will, it is really interesting to think about and consider what were the rules, how were they set, and who was it set for, and who was excluded from that. And some of that exclusion extends even today in various aspects of our society. And so I think for me that Naturalization Act is a very key moment in history when talking about race and ethnicity. I think here we continue to see various elements of our history, and one that I wanted to highlight is one of our many partners through this particular program. Our Bethune-Cookman College got its start under a different name in Daytona in 1904, and so I really enjoy and appreciate looking at in the context of what's happening around the country and the globe, when our institutions are founded. What were the values of the institution at that time? How have those changed over time? And how have we maintained or held on to anchor values, if you will, that continue to show up and guide us in our work today? I think on this particular slide, I again want to give mention our U.S. Virgin Island, our University of the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the history that they also hold on to, coming onto the scene in 1927 in relationship with the United States. And so that begins part of their journey in establishing the University of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Another key moment for me that I like to share in this presentation is focused on the 1946 case of Mendez versus Westminster. If you're not familiar with that case, I want to acknowledge that we are navigating or living through our Hispanic Heritage Month in the U.S. Hispanic Heritage Month is from September 15th to October 15th. And so my nod to this moment of celebration, I will use this particular landmark case in the United States. And so Mendez versus Westminster, the story of Mendez is that Felicita Mendez was a Puerto Rican woman married to Mr. Mendez in that time, and their family lived in California. And in the 40s, you may know from your own historical knowledge, that we were navigating concentration camps in the United States, the internment camps for our Japanese sisters, brothers, and siblings. And the Mendez family were in relationship with a Japanese family that were being sent to the internment camps. And the Mendez family signed a lease agreement with a Japanese family and said, if you allow us to work this land, we will lease it from you, protect the land while you are away. And when you return, we will return the land to you and give you a certain amount of from the proceeds that we're able to earn. And so the Mendez family and this other family were able to work that particular agreement out. When the Mendez family acquired the land that they had leased, they went to register their children, Sylvia Mendez and her cousins, into the local Westminster school. Well, the local school said that they would take Sylvia Mendez's cousins because they were light-skinned, but Sylvia Mendez was too dark for them to enroll. And they suggested that the Mendez family go, I think it was over 20 miles away to take Sylvia to school. The Mendez family engaged in activism work. Miss Mendez, while her husband was working, worked on getting a petition signed by more than 1,000 folks in that area. And they ended up engaging in a lawsuit with Westminster. That particular case in California ends up going to their Supreme Court, and the governor of California, Governor Warren at the time, signs into law for the state of California desegregating school systems based on the Mendez case in '46. Moving from there, the attorneys that worked on the Mendez versus Westminster case also worked on the Brown versus Board of Education case in '54. In 1954, our Brown versus Board case ends up desegregating, to the US Supreme Court and ends up desegregating schools throughout the United States. I share these two cases with you because the relationship between our cultures and ethnicity is a powerful one. In this story alone, we look at, I have mentioned, our Japanese family, our Latinx family, and our African American families that are involved in truly transforming the experience of education throughout this country. But when we tell these stories, we don't often share the intersectionality. We don't often share them as building blocks. And so I offer this story as a powerful reminder of what minoritized communities can accomplish when working together, when building from each other's knowledge, history, when really collaborating or building coalitions. And so I hope that as we move on through this conversation and through the series of presentations throughout the semester, we really think about what coalitions do you have access to? What opportunities do you have to engage with individuals from different cultures, backgrounds, and ethnicities to really move our efforts through education forward? And so hold on to that story. And again, happy Hispanic Heritage Month. If you weren't planning on celebrating, I hope this gives you an opportunity to celebrate a little bit with me. Another section or pieces of history that I want to give shout outs to are our Santa Fe College, again, another partner, Tallahassee Community College, and just when these institutions were founded. And so it is interesting to think that building from the last slide, once desegregation happens and integration begins to become the way of the land, we have additional institutions emerging in our states and in our school system. Well, again, I hope that just looking at some key moments in history give us an opportunity to just reflect on some powerful opportunities to engage with history, with knowledge, and to start thinking about how do those moments from years ago, from the 1700s forward, how do aspects of those moments still influence our policies, our procedures, the way that we organize our institutions, even the curriculum that you were given when you were trained, if you are faculty, or the practices and behavior that you were socialized or trained in when you were hired in your positions. How does history influence those practices? We don't often make space or have an opportunity to critique or think about how history has shaped our present and how it influences our future. And I hope that this activity allows us to do some of that. In my work, I sometimes share that the first language I learned when I was born was Spanish. And my father served in the military for 30 years and gave us an opportunity as a family to move around to a lot of different countries growing up. And so I was able to learn other languages. And the reason I share that is that when I think about our work, and when I translate internally from Spanish to English or another language, language plays a very big part for me in how we share experiences and understand the world around me. And so from that perspective, I tend to be very intentional about my use of language. And I want to invite us into a conversation because I've had many experiences where and this may have happened to you as well. We can be in a meeting or in a class or in a community gathering and be using language similarly, but not have the same meaning, right? And so I want to take a moment of pause just to explore language related to cultural competency and make sure that all of us are on the same page and can learn from each other's understanding of various terms and words. These concepts are not new terms or new concepts, but I do think it's important to really think about what do we mean when we use these in the context of higher education. Cultural competency is considered to have been born out of counseling psychology literature. It's been around even before the 1980s, but really took root in the 1980s. And I think that using this opportunity to engage in the following activity will allow us to examine cultural issues in more complex and comprehensive ways in terms of how we communicate. And so from that perspective, what I'd like to do is to move us into our next opportunity to engage in a small group discussion. We'll give groups about 10 minutes again, and we're going to assign you to groups based on the terms that we will be discussing. And so the first term, we'll have about, I think, one or two groups talk about creating a working definition for the word culture. We'll have another group or two focus on creating a working definition for the word competence. And then we'll have the final team work on creating a working definition for the phrase cultural competence. And so again, when you get into your groups will be named the word or phrase that your group is asked to create a working definition for. When we return together after our 10 minutes, I'll invite at least one person from each group to share the working definition that you came up with. And so please, when you get into your groups, decide pretty quickly who can serve as the scribe for your group and who will be the reporter or who will share out once we come back into the large room. Enjoy your second dialogue. I look forward to welcoming y'all back soon. Looks like folks are coming back. I hope y'all enjoyed that piece, that opportunity to engage with your colleagues. As mentioned, we're hoping that there was a scribe and or a reporter in each group. And so I would love to start with just inviting the groups that used or worked on the word culture to create a working definition to maybe share. Do we have a volunteer to report back on culture? Yes, is it Carolyn? Miss Carolyn, go ahead.
Okay, so we Googled and then we did a slight modification. Of course, right? You start somewhere. Okay, culture is an umbrella term which encompasses the social behavior and norms found in human groups that may include the knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities, and habits of individuals in these groups. And what we recognized is defining the group. So we could say something is American culture, but that will only fit very few things, right? But what if we're doing the culture of this particular gang in a neighborhood, or the culture of a particular religion, or people who associate with a particular religion? So cultures, depending on the group, is going to include or not include many elements.
Absolutely. Thank you for y'all's work on that. And I really appreciate the examples that you gave, Because if we continue drilling down, there are cultures in the offices that you work in. And so the group of faculty that you work with, there's a culture that you were introduced to and a culture that you add to, right? Each of us add to culture as well in our different spaces. If you're an administrator or a staff member, similarly, the longer that we're in a place, we get to negotiate some of the cultural pieces. Environment affects culture. And so if you've ever moved your department or office from one space to the other, new space, new offices, new classes, new classrooms, new technologies, all shape and impact culture. So I really appreciate what you've shared there. Did we have another group engage with the term culture that would like to share? Just want to make sure.
So we got the term cultural competence.
Okay, well, let's hold on that one. We'll definitely touch base on that. Let me quickly share a term or a definition from scholarship that I want to just share with you all from our scholarship related to cultural competency. And Cross shares this idea that you touched on, Carolyn, and definitely talks about patterns of human behavior of a social group. And so I noted that in y'all's working definition, you also captured the words behavior and group. And so spot on there. Thank you so much. Let's use our next term. Let's use a little bit of time to unpack the next term. And so let's go to competence before we get to the full phrase cultural competence. Who is our reporter or scribe from groups that engaged with developing a working term for competence? Who would like to share?
I would like to share. Hi, my name is Iva.
Thank you, Iva.
So at the beginning, I don't quite understand the competent means. So I Google translated and talked to my group members. I think how we understand is that you have the ability to do something, to understand other people. That's
Absolutely.
how I understand. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Absolutely. Competency for us in this work includes what you have shared. And so it's the capacity to function effectively, the capacity to function effectively. And so it is important for us to think about these terms individually, but this leads us to where I think our colleague, and I'm looking across the screen to find our sister, is it who was sharing earlier that they had the term cultural competency or the phrase cultural competency?
Sorry, we do. I did.
Oh, wonderful. Please, would you share what y'all came up with?
Yeah, definitely. So we came up with this definition, which I definitely love. It's cultural competencies, the awareness of our differences, as well as the respect and understanding and appreciation for each other's cultures, backgrounds, and identities, and to effectively communicate those differences across different complexes and identities.
That is amazing. I think your group should get back together and publish your working definition. That was awesome. I really appreciated the components that you shared there. The awareness, the respect, the functional, the piece of communicating, I think is very, very important. I'd like to share, Pope, Reynolds, and Mueller have a definition. They first published it in 2004, and I think they revised it in 2019. But I really appreciate this framing that they give us. It is to work with others in meaningful, relevant, and productive ways. To work with others in meaningful, relevant, and productive ways. I think that captures a lot of the elements that you all shared in your working definition as well. In terms of, for me, just moving us from thought, this piece of cultural competency moves us into action. And your working definition also moved us into action. And so I really appreciate that aspect of this phrase. Any final thoughts or reactions that came up for folks in this particular activity working with your groups? And I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment. Anything else that came up that someone might want to share?
In our group, we added the word recognizing, valuing, because that's some of the things that we as African Americans or Latinos and other people from other races sometimes are not valued as equal. So we wanted to add that in there. I was in the group with Thomas Beckwith.
Absolutely. Thank you. Can you share with me, has there been a time from what you've shared where you remember feeling valued? What did that feel like? What did it sound like? What was that like for you?
So my content is that I am from the U.S. Virgin Islands. So I come from a place that that institutionalized racism didn't exist where I grew up. So I grew up always feeling can do, valued, etc. I am from the Caribbean. Migrating to the States, I went to Tuskegee and I had an encounter in Montgomery. And it was, I didn't understand it. And often Africans, Americans from the continent, US, would tell me that I don't understand institutionalized racism. And so I summarize it as growing up, your parents always told you don't do that. They grab your hand because you can't talk to the white person that way. You couldn't do that, you couldn't do that. So you grew up understanding how to protect yourself and safeguard yourself. Whereas being in the Caribbean, we didn't have those kind of limitations. However, fast forward to 2020, you know, we're being the word that's in my mind is infiltrated, and maybe that might be a negative word. But we're being, you know, the Western culture is definitely moving in to what they consider paradise and maybe too nice. I don't know, but anyway, so they're bringing their ways with them. Western people bring their ways with them. So some of the cultural values and attitudes might be a little bit different in 2020, but it's nothing like what you experienced. And just on a last note, my son was visiting, who was 28, the other day in the Virgin Islands because my grandmother had died. And the police pulled up behind us just driving. And he was like, "Ma, that's such a different experience of when you're in the States and the police pull up behind you. You get so nervous. Here, the police pull up behind you and you don't feel like, oh my God, what's gonna happen next?"
Yeah.
So thank you for allowing me to share.
No, thank you for sharing your stories, and also my condolences to you and your family. I'm so sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
It is such a powerful piece that you bring up that we don't often get an opportunity to consider, and that is the experiences of individuals who, in the context of the U.S., in terms of the 50 U.S. states, we're minoritized in this context, but we come from majority spaces. And so the island of Puerto Rico, when I'm home, I'm not, I don't feel the stigma that I feel in the US. When I'm engaging with faculty or researchers in Spanish-speaking countries, the way that I'm received, treated, and respected is very different than when I'm in majority white spaces in the US. And so I appreciate you bringing that up into our space for us to consume and really think about what are our experiences like and how do they shift and change based on the context of where we live, where we're researching, where we're practicing. Very powerful thoughts. Thank you so much. Well, I encourage us to continue staying curious about words. When folks ask or share that they don't feel seen or heard or valued, let's not lean on our own understanding of what those words mean. Let's be curious, and in our practice, ask if a student shares that they didn't feel valued or seen in our spaces. Let's ask them, what does that mean? And give me an example of a time when you have felt that way. I think that's one way for us to learn how to shift our practice, our language, how to shift our curriculum at times, if that is necessary. And so please hold on to that. What I'd like to do here is give us I love Dr. Chandler's phrase, a bio break. If we could take a little bit of time to stretch, we've been sitting for a while, refill coffee or get coffee, that would be fantastic. I'd like to welcome us back, if y'all are comfortable with it, at let's say 10:10, we'll come back together at 10:10. Talk to you soon. Seconds. As folks are coming back into our space, I just want to remind folks, if you joined a little later, in the chat you will find a link to a pre-assessment, and so would encourage you all to complete the pre-assessment. And just know that a little bit later in the presentation you will be given access to the post-assessment, and we just ask that before you disconnect from this gathering that you complete the post-assessment. This gives us great data to help us further develop this particular program and make sure that we've met some of our outcomes that we have outlined and shared with you all earlier. And so please complete those if you will. Well, what I'd like to do next, and looking at the historical context related to higher education or impacting higher education, focused on race and ethnicity. We move from there to just check in with each other, with our colleagues on language, to make sure that as we continue building in this work, that we're sharing definitions, that we're talking about the same thing. And then from here, what I'd like to do is to introduce us, to move us into considering and thinking about awareness and knowledge and how we develop that. One of the ways that I'd like to do that is by either introducing or engaging, re-engaging, if you've already seen it, with a TED Talk entitled "The Danger of a Single Story." I think this gives us a great model for us to look at, and will directly connect to the theoretical model that we will follow up with by Bobby Harrell, The Cycle of Socialization. And so I look forward to engaging with you. Now, I will share with you that I have seen this particular TED Talk, I can't even tell you how many times, probably 40 times at this point. And every time I engage with this TED Talk, I'm a different person. Experiences, I'm a day older usually, at least, if not several weeks older. Experiences have come to me. I think about just in the last 5 days, how much has happened in this nation, in this country, how many lives we've lost to COVID, the political climate, just so much is happening that when I engage with this TED Talk or other material, I try to listen for something new and different. And so if you have heard Adichie speak before, Chimamanda, or if you have seen this particular TED Talk, I simply offer a humble suggestion to listen for something new, because you're not the person that you were the last time you heard it. And so from that, would love to engage. One other piece that I'll share before we start the video is that I'm a visual learner, and so For those of you that are visual learners, we have included a transcript of this TED Talk in the Google Classroom for you to access. And so if you want to follow along with the words, you can do it that way. And the video itself is closed captioned as well, to help us all engage and access the material fully. My request of you is, as we're watching the video together or listening to the video, jot down 1 or 2 takeaways. What's 1 or 2 things that you hear that resonate with you, that stand out to you? And we will debrief that when we get together after the video. Leslie is going to help us connect with this, and so please enjoy the next few moments.
And I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them, and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story, as had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I, too, am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind: the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Tyler, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Okoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who were not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds, films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce? What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I am confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist, and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and a kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for engaging in that particular video. I hope that the TED Talk brought some meaningful pieces to light for you. One of the reasons that I enjoyed this particular piece so much is because our author gives us moments where she has engaged with the single story, and moments where she's told a single story, and moments where a single story has been told about her. I love how she starts off talking about her mother. You know, in my culture, no one but the child can talk about their own mother And even cousins, they're not talking. So I don't talk about my aunties. If my cousins are fussing about their aunties, I do not engage. I just listen. And so it is powerful to see this scholar, this educator, this writer really just share pieces of her own story and moments where she has been told a single story and believed it, and other moments where she has told a single story. The back and forth of that illustrates the messiness of this work, I think, at times. And so I hope that it was helpful. It also, to me, gives us an understanding of the role that we can play with the single story. And in this work in general, we will not always get it right, but staying with this process, engaging with this process again and again, will allow us to become stronger in creating more inclusive spaces and environments. I want to move us to one last pair and share. This time it'll just be two of you, and you will only have about 5 minutes. And so Leslyn will move us into one last breakout room. In this space, I invite you to maybe share just one thing that stood out to you the most about this TED Talk with your partner. Remember, we only have 5 minutes, and so share that space, be kind to your partner, and give them time to share with you, but also be ready to share at least one takeaway, a notable quote, or something that stood out from her message, and then we'll come back together. Leslyn, thank you for moving us into this one last breakout room. So, do I have a volunteer to share maybe one notable quote or one takeaway briefly? What's something that stood out to you if you haven't had a chance to share yet and you're motivated to?
Mine was at the end when she says stories can repair dignity. That was just so powerful, especially in what's happening, just yesterday with Breonna Taylor and so on. And people are just, losing the motivation and focus and so on, and just trying to remember that. It was just powerful.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
I guess, hang on, let me turn on my video here. I guess one thing that really struck me at the very beginning of her talk, that I had a very similar experience. So I grew up in Suriname, right on the equator, and Suriname had been a Dutch colony for more than 300 years and had only become independent, I guess I was in Suriname at the time of independence. And so in school, we were reading books about Dutch geography and Dutch history, and the kids in our books were talking about snow. And in geography, we learned how the Rhine entered our country at Lobach, and we didn't have a country, the Rhine, and we had never seen snow. And so I could really relate to that idea that we grew up with this idea that this is how the world should be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Powerful piece. I think often I try to be very mindful of what I consume, not just in terms of food, but what I allow my eyes and my ears to consume as well, and how that influences my thinking, my understanding. Very important piece, very important piece. Let me share my screen.
Was that Carolyn that was going to say something?
Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna say, I think her story underscored how important it is, the education of our children, how impressionable they are, how much good we can do to open their eyes to the possibilities, or we can totally crush them. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Very important. So some things that I would share with you all to think about as you leave this particular activity, to yourselves after our session. Think about single stories that have been assigned to you in your life, maybe as recent as the other day. When have you experienced that? Reflect on what are times when you have assigned a single story to others. And then finally, how does this relate to developing cultural competence? I think for me, one of those elements is around how important it is to have multiple stories, as she shares with us. If you only have one friend that is X, Y, or Z, that is not going to give you the competency that you need to be able to engage in a community. If you had one bad experience with a student of X identity, that's not going to give you competency to be able to navigate or work with students from that particular identity, or community members or colleagues from that particular identity. And so I encourage us to really think about this in the framework that Adichie gives us. Moving into the cycle of socialization, what I want to share with you all, and I will do my very best to connect this to the TED Talk that we just watched, is the article by Bobby Harrell that was also posted in the Google Classroom for us to consume. I hope that this was a helpful reading for you. It is one of my go-to theories to help me think about my own experience journey and how I can engage in action. As we get started with this particular model, the principles or the foundations that are shared with us are about the cycle itself. And so these elements are existing in the background, if you will. I really appreciated how our author starts his reading with this particular piece. And just as a reminder, the idea that the cycle itself is pervasive, meaning that the influences are coming from all angles, all sides, all sources. The idea that the cycle is consistent. And what that means is that it is patterned, it is predictable. You can count on it behaving in certain ways and watch that happen. The physical cycle that's in the image in the article is circular. And that really speaks to it being self-supporting. The self-perpetuating piece of the article talks about how it really interdependent on society itself and how we act and behave and engage. And the last piece that I think is just as important as the others is that it is invisible. It can be unconscious and unnamed. And because of that piece, I think we have to really pay attention to and give ourselves grace when we're engaging in the cycle, but also give others grace and be patient with ourselves and others when we are working through moments of discrimination or acts of oppression when possible. And so hold on to these as foundational to this actual model that we're going to be engaging with. Here, on this slide, we start going through the cycle, and the beginning phase of this cycle, Bobby Harrell mentions that we only enter this cycle once. It is when we're born, and we're born really innocent. We don't have an understanding or meaning associated with identities or culture or behavior or practices. We are just consuming. And so this is the one time in our lives when we are born and when we are infants where we're in that particular stage. What's powerful to think about as we reflect on the cycle of socialization at that stage is how we play into this. I will share an example recently. Well, I don't know that it's recent anymore. Prior to COVID, I was invited to one of my good friends' baby shower. He and his wife were expecting, and the gender of the baby had already been shared. And so I went and bought blue blankets for the boys. And I didn't even think about it. I just associate colors, blue and pink, with male and female. And it wasn't until the unwrapping of gifts and the cake portion of the festivities where I was paying attention and realized how I play into the socialization of these unborn children. They have not even been born yet, but because they were said to be male, there were all kinds of trucks and associations that we bring into space related to what little boys should and would want to wear, dress, and play with. And so it is just interesting to think about how we play into socialization for individuals that are in this stage. The other piece of this model is first socialization. Before I get to that, you know, when I think about the TED Talk, Adichie talks about being born in Nigeria and talks about her early life. And so she walks us through the cycle of socialization with many different beautiful examples that come to life in her talk. And so I will walk us through and just remind us of some of the things that she shared. In first socialization, this particular part of the model really speaks to us being at the hands of the closest people that we love and trust. It's our immediate family, our parents, our siblings, if we have them, and possibly grandparents if they're in close proximity to us. They are the ones that, for many, are taking the lead in socializing us in terms of learning culture and behavior and language and what to do and what not to do, how to behave. They shape concepts of self-concept and self-perception. Those individuals in our lives also guide us because we have not developed the ability to think for ourselves yet in many aspects. And so regardless of the content of teachings, we have been exposed to strong sets of rules growing up when we're very young in this space. Some assumptions that we can't help but shape us. I think another example of socialization, if you are a graduate student or teaching undergraduates or doctoral students, if you are an administrator or a staff member and you are helping students engage or transition into an academic environment, we also socialize students. Now, they're not babies and they're not infants, but they are students that have not engaged with higher education before. And so we play a part in the socialization of our students through our syllabi, through what we include, through how we teach, things of that nature. For Adichie, she mentioned in first socialization, the story of how her mother tells people she started writing at the age of 2, and she's like, I wasn't 2, it was more like 4. I really like that part of how she can honor her mother's story, but kind of give some caveats and some clarifications. When she talks about the stories written in pencil and illustrated in crayon, and how she engages. And so she talks about how she was influenced in that phase of the process. Moving from there, would like to give this opportunity for us to just reflect to ourselves for just a moment. We won't give a lot of time to this, but I just want you to take a moment to yourself and think about one of your identities, whether it is gender or religion or your birth order, for if you're the firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn. Think about what you were taught about that specific social identity. And maybe, I know I have here on the slide, write at least 5 things. We won't have time for that, but maybe think about 1 or 2 things that you were taught about how to be, how to just be, whether it is your ethnicity or your race or your country of origin. What were you taught growing up about how to perform that identity? Again, for the sake of time, we won't have an opportunity to debrief fully, but if you're comfortable, please feel free to add into the chat the identity and maybe one thing you were taught about that identity so that we can reflect on that collectively moving forward. And I encourage you to go back to this activity and really think about, how were you raised? What were you taught? What did you perceive or learn? What were the messages that were direct, and what were some of the messages that were not direct about how to be who you are? Very powerful learning that can come from that reflection. Moving on with the cycle of socialization, we get to the institutional and cultural part of the model. Here on this part of the model, we really start engaging with schools, places of worship, and not just engaging, but we start understanding the meaning of those spaces and places. This can be visiting medical facilities, engaging with sports teams or traditions of that nature, legal systems or political systems. The institution and cultural socialization that comes from those spaces is very important for us to think about how that shapes who we are and how we have developed and emerged over time. With that space, we also learn rules, right? We learn what is allowed and not allowed in those spaces. For most of us in this part of enforcement, as we move from the institutions to enforcement, when those rules are broken that we learn in those institutions, we're corrected, and sometimes very swiftly corrected through that arrow of enforcement in this model. Part of this is this idea of going against the norm, right? We learn quickly what it means to contradict the norm or to try to think independently. We see examples of students or peers or children or others that try to think independently, and how they're described by our family members, how they're described by all of these institutions that are listed here. People who work against the grain are labeled troublemakers, right? I love how during the celebration of John Lewis's life, the slogan or his frame of good trouble has been adopted, I think, more broadly in recent generations or recent years. But historically, the good was not included in people who work against the norm, right? And if members, if individuals work against that norm, the response from those in the norm in terms of punishments or consequences are very clear for us, trying to get us to get back in line with the status quo, if you will. And so here, we're not going to have time to do this, but I encourage you to look through the article and read the examples that are given related to moments growing up where we would have heard rules and how those rules were reinforced in our own experiences related to gender or related to picking on others, things of that nature. I think that can be very, very important. We can learn how, or we can reflect on how the consequences and benefits from resisting or acting against the norm happens. Finally, in the cycle of socialization, we have the directions for change and results in this particular model. With Adichie, when she was talking about, for her, two examples that I documented around direction of change and action were around how she's teaching writing workshops throughout Nigeria and her country. She has partnered with a friend of hers and created a nonprofit to refurbish and build libraries and fill those libraries with books. And so there is an example of how in this model, there are two choices in terms of results, right? We either do something or we do nothing. Those are two examples of her doing something. But there are also examples that she didn't elaborate on when she did nothing, right? And so an example of doing nothing is when she talks about her trip to Mexico and not preparing for that trip to Mexico in terms of the dialogue or stories around immigration. She just bought into whatever was being told of immigration, and that was a learning moment for her. In this theory, one of the things that I appreciate is that to do nothing is still an act. For us not to disrupt socialization is still a choice and an act, and there are consequences to that. And again, there are times, I will share very clearly, as an administrator, I choose to do nothing politically, professionally. I do choose my battles when it comes to disrupting the cycle of socialization in the academy. I do not challenge every single thing, because we will be dismissed from our teaching positions, from our administrative positions if we take that approach. But I do look for opportunities to engage in action and change to move our institutions forward to justice. And so with this theory, what I want to leave you with is this idea that we have the ability to influence systems. And it is important for us to reflect on these different components about our own story and journey so that we can be prepared and able to engage in navigating our curriculum, our classes, our administrative positions, our relationship with students and community differently. With that said, I want to pause there as we are running quickly out of time and make sure that I give just two quick reminders. We will continue building off of this conversation, off the dialogue, off the gifts that you gave your peers and the gifts that you received throughout the day in our second workshop. But want to make sure that you all have access to all the materials in the Google Classroom to continue reading and thinking and reflecting on these pieces. And also in the chat, you will hopefully find the post survey link for you to complete before you leave us. Dr. Chandler, Dr. Cummings, are there any final thoughts that you all want to share, or any questions that we want to engage in?
Thank you for this session, and for those who have to leave, you are welcome to log off. We just wanted to provide a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, for any questions that people might have. And if not, I will ask Dr. Hernandez to address one thing that we did in cohort 1 that might be valuable here as well. But anybody have any questions? And again, if you have to leave, it is 11 and we're done, but I just wanted to give folks an opportunity.
Well, I just have one comment. Looking at the entire screen, I'm the one of the 2 guys here other than speaker. That is something.
An amazing observation.
Absolutely.
I promise we had more men in cohort 1, but it to your point, it was still the same similar dynamic though. Yeah.
It takes courage, and it takes courage, and it takes energy for us to engage in this work. And so thank you for joining us. And we also have the opportunity as male identified individuals to encourage and influence our brothers to join this work. That is something that I encourage all of us. If you're in relationship with male colleagues, notice what has been shared by Dr. Hu, and understand that we can encourage them and say, you need to take personal responsibility. If we're in relationship with folks, I encourage us to use our relationships to encourage them on. Thank you for that observation.
Thank you.
If there's no one else, one of the 2 questions that came up last time, and I think this would be very valuable for this group. One, there was a question about how do I maintain my sanity in my mind while trying to decide when to use my voice and when not to use my voice. And I think you gave us a solid recommendation on that. And then the second one was anecdote stories of our administrators and leaders. How do we help navigate and explain to them we can't make decisions based on the one story?
Right. No, absolutely. No, I appreciate both of those questions. I think one of the things I shared around just our sanity and not burning out in this work was a practice that I engage in, which is I have a journal at home, and I keep my journal at home. I'm not a big journaler, although I am a qualitative researcher, so one would think I would write all the time, but I don't. But what I share with you in that is many years ago, I started documenting moments where I was really impressed by leaders who engaged in administration and in research related to diversity and inclusion. Really, it wasn't focused just on diversity and inclusion, but it can be focused on anything. But I would document and just enter a sentence, a paragraph saying, I really appreciated when Dr. Chandler did this. I want to do this one day when I grow up, or have access to that kind of power or authority. In the back of that journal, I would write down things that were disappointing in the leaders. When a president made a decision or a dean makes a decision that does not seem to be in line with our values. The reason that the journal is so important and stays at home is because the journal doesn't betray us. The journal captures a moment in time when we are frustrated, upset, or very appreciative, but gives us an opportunity to document that and monitor that differently from home. In later years, because I've been doing this for a while, as I have become a dean or become a faculty member, it has helped me to really look back at moments where I was disappointed in what I saw in others, and think about my own power, my own influence, my own ability to shape or shift culture. And so that document helps me release and not hold on to the frustration, but it also allows me to revisit those moments and learn from them. And so I encourage you to start your own practice of documenting moments where you are impressed, proud, inspired, and moments when you're disappointed and frustrated, and use that as a tool to help guide your own practice in this profession. Dr. Chandler, the other piece that you asked was around, I remember the one around how do we maintain some sanity and not burn out. But what was the other piece in terms of when we use our voice?
Yes, and try to redirect away from the one story and decision making.
Absolutely. No, I cannot agree and emphasize that more. I think it is very important for us to make decisions based on good information, and build relationships so that we can tap into and explore and stay curious. And so when one person behaves a certain way, I try to approach that from a place of curiosity, from a place of understanding, and trying to figure out, well, what's going on for this individual, but then start looking to see if there are patterns across our campus or across our community, that would give more of a story. One act does not define a department, a class, an individual, but a pattern of behavior is definitely something that is important to look for. The other piece in terms of engaging with change from that perspective is, if we identify patterns, we also need to identify colleagues that we can join either coalitions or collaborations with to address that type of behavior, or that need that must change in our community. Being a lonely voice on a campus or a department or an office may not get us very far. But if we go together, if we can build communities that we can think and act together, I think that there is one more efficient and effective ways to do it. And the other is that it protects us. I think in this work, you also need to approach this work from a place of protecting your energy, your spirit, your efforts. And so I hope that helps. I'm definitely happy to engage further in our next call.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Y'all, we had an awesome training. It's 11:05 and we want to go ahead and close out. I can't say it enough. I appreciate each and every one of you for attending and participating. And as I like to say, for trusting us with your professional development time. And so we look forward to seeing you in session 2, and we'll send out a follow-up email reminding you of your homework for the next session, and we'll provide the recording and slides. So thank you so much and have a great week. Jody, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just real quickly. I don't know if anybody else besides Mary is out on the West Coast, but I think she deserves a round of applause because this was really early for her, and they've got all kinds of craziness happening out there in California right now. So
yes, Mary and Miguel. And
that's right, Miguel's out there too, but Miguel's leading this, so he must have picked the time.
Yes. So Mary, blame your California friend.
We got my mentor on here too, Cherie Balecki. So we both. Yeah.
That's the same institute.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you so much.
Be well. Thank you, my friend. Take
Thank
care.
you so much.
I'm removed. Hang on. Oh, somebody.
I'm glad they pointed out we had other California people now. I appreciate that they don't know.